My name's Tommy Fitzpatrick. I live in San Antonio, Texas, and I'm an artist, mainly painting, but do some sculpture, and then I'm a professor at Texas State University.
Okay. How long have you been painting?
I've been painting almost 30 years professionally, but I've always been interested in painting since I was a child. And painting itself has been an escape for me. I've always felt like paintings were more interesting than the real world throughout my whole life. And as a child, my mother would buy me books on artists that I would look at, and we would go to the museum, and that really made me want to be a painter.
Was there ever a moment growing up to where you're like, this is something I'm good at, or this is something that is my pastime? Do you have a moment like that you could explain that it was like a aha?
Well, in high school, when I was ninth grade, I made a work of art, and then I put it into a show, and it won the show. And that was sort of like, oh, wow. And it felt very easy, like it had an ease to the making of it. It was very, it was joyful to create, and it was nice to be recognized for something. So that kind of made me get interested in it as well. My uncle is an artist as well, and I'd always admired his work. My father, he was a veterinarian, but he's really interested in photography, and I spent a lot of time with him photographing things, which made me, he was very creative, or still is very creative, and got me interested in kind of looking at things in a way.
Was there anything along the way, or what made you jump in and do that art competition, or was there any teacher along the way that helped in your kind of grade school?
I've just always had a kind of a drive to do something, and I always struggled sleeping as a child. And in our house, the upstairs was my mom's craft room, my dad's dark room, and where he did his photography. So my room was right next to it. So at night I would always go and do work. So I guess it was sort of like, came out of, just felt like I needed to do it. That makes sense.
What is your educational background coming out of high school, and what have you done from there?
So I started undergrad. I took art classes in high school and enjoyed it very much. But I didn't become super rigorous towards painting until I went down to Austin to receive my BA in painting. And when I was at UT, I was able to have a lot of great teachers. I met Peter Saul, who's still alive, really great artist. I got to meet Robert Colescott. He came for a summer program, and the list kind of goes on. And so I was very inspired by these artists, and Austin in general was a very creative place. Felt different than Dallas. And in the summer, while I was at UT, I went to Providence to RISD and did a summer program there, and got even more interested in art, loved New England, and then realized that I wanted to go to school up east somewhere, or back east somewhere. And once I graduated from UT, I went I got into Yale University's painting and printmaking program in New Haven, and went there for a couple of years and did that. And all of that, I mean, that was sort of my formal education, but after I graduated from Yale, I got a job working at the Metropolitan Museum of Art for 4 years, and that was sort of another type of education I got, being able to be around that collection all the time for 4 years. But that's sort of like my formal education.
In the works that we see now, it's going to be submitted for the show, very architectural. Has that something been a theme throughout what you've done, or has there been other things, or has your
Right.
I've seen your collection, your book you showed us. Has that always been a draw for you, or is that something that you're into now?
Since I'd say 2000, it started off, I got interested in sort of roadside culture, and I was painting signage, and that led to sort of motels and different forms that I would see along old highways. And then became interested in the man-made structure. I mean, I think originally, like if I really think about it, my dad would take me alone to Colorado in the summers, and he loved Ansel Adams, but he loved old mine ruins. So we'd spent summers photographing silver and gold mines with large format cameras, and at the time I didn't really think about it, but lately I've been thinking about it, that I think that really resonated, like his focus on those structures and trying to document them in some way, I think made me take heed to the importance of architecture and how, that buildings outlast us, and there's a permanence to them and a timeliness that goes on and on. So that's always been, architecture has been a thing I've been interested in for the last 30 years in one way or another.
Any good highways over the Route 66 to go check out?
Yeah. So I've done the Route 66 with my dad actually, which was really exciting. He was more into the trains and I was more into the car stuff. And I think it's like a generational thing, but yeah, Route 66 is great. And then when I moved from Brooklyn to Houston for my first teaching job, it was at Southwest Texas State, which is Texas State where I am now. But I had a part-time job and I was driving from Houston into San Marcos. But through Luling and some of these roads, you could find some really interesting, before the Eisenhower Highway plan, there's a lot of really cool roads. And I would intentionally kind of divert and try to find those structures, and they were going away. And a lot of them outside of Houston I photographed and made paintings of, and a lot of those are gone now. So I feel good about the fact that there's the paintings are kind of like a stand-in for those kind of relics of or nostalgic kind of parts of American history.
Walk me through the structure of some of this painting. You were talking to Deborah a little bit before on the layering, the thickness. Some people think that they're actually pieces put on. But
right.
Tell me a little bit about your process you go and what medium that you start with.
Right. So this form itself, the sort of house form, comes sort of out of when I was sort of painting buildings that I'll start over.
All good.
Okay. So there's an architect group named Herzog de Marin who has kind of consumed a lot of my interest in architecture, and to the point where I've gone to Beijing and looked at some of their buildings there, and I've been to Tokyo and I've made paintings of their buildings that are there, and they're more commercial buildings. But when I started working at Texas State, I came across a book in the library of this house they built out of concrete that was poured concrete. It was a double pitched roof, really simple kind of farmhouse design, but it was all concrete. And I decided to make a painting of it. So I made a painting of that, and it had some other qualities to it, but it really resonated with me that, wow, this really simple house structure has got a universality to it. It's got a kind of a feeling of like home, but it's not specifically any certain thing. It's more of an idea about home. So after I finished that painting, I thought, wow, something about this I've got to continue in a way. And that led me to sort of simplify things down quite a bit, both with imagery. I sort of started to I've made almost 50 of these now, and have kind of have different variations, but most of them are frontal, double pitched roof structures that I create on the computer. At the same time, I was looking at trying to reduce and simplify the form into kind of an iconic kind of image that represented the work. I also have been addressing the way the paintings are made. And as a painter and as a teacher, I tell my students, it's way more important how you make it than what you make. Whatever it's portraying is important, the motif, but how are you using the materials in an innovative way? And so acrylic paint is relatively new, a new kind of paint. It comes out of house enamels in the 50s or 60s, and then in the 70s or 80s, really nice acrylic paint starts to be generated. When I lived in Houston, I worked for Frank Stella, who was using a lot of these golden products that I use on these paintings. And they just offer a lot they have great flexibility in terms of what they can do with texture and things like that. And so the the way these paintings are made is, I consider painting like, it's like building a house. And you sort of build a foundation, and then the scaffolding goes up, and then you put the skin on it and the roof, and then that kind of creates the vessel. But the paintings are built in layers, and they start as kind of thinner paintings to begin with, similar to my earlier work. Like the inside the window is sort of like the kind of brushless, non-textural quality. You can actually see the weave of the canvas there that's wrapped around the panel. And then I begin to sort of build up these surfaces using gallons. Like this painting's probably 7 gallons of acrylic polymer that's a matte surface, and that I'll pile onto the painting, and then I'll pull it. And what's been, I early on in my work, I was very interested in kind of brushless painting, and I didn't want any kind of marks. But about 2 or 3 years ago, I sort of gave up on that kind of notion of perfection, and started to use the material in a way that allowed it to kind of have more of a voice in the whole thing. So, you know, I'm pulling the material. It's not like I want it to be smooth, but I want it to be smooth-ish. And then it's kind of got its own ideas about the way it's going to happen. And after 10, you know, maybe a dozen pulls, I'll land on something that seems right, and I'll stop there. And so it's a bit of chance involved with the application of the paints, and then how it all comes out, which I appreciate, the kind of the emulsification of paint, and the way it kind of creates its own, has its own qualities. And then the paintings themselves become like sculptural. Like, although it's a painting, it's like a bas relief. And if you get close to the paintings, like 2 inches, and you look into the paint, it's like, it's not even close to a house. It's something much different. It's very abstract. And I like that the paint itself has its own typography, almost like its own structure is created through the thicker applications. And one thing that excites me about that is that then the paintings themselves become a singular object that isn't photographic, and that isn't a recapitulation of the world itself, but then becomes its own object all itself, almost like a dream, or like a memory of of something that exists in the world, but it's not in the world, if that makes sense. It relates to the world, but it's not part of this world. It's its own world.
In going through and putting that much on at a time, are there times when you're wanting to jump ahead and get to that next step, but you gotta wait for the paint to dry?
Yeah, I mean, they're very process driven, and there's a certain way they kind of demand you to do certain things. A lot of times I'll put down an application and won't be completely stoked about it, and then I'll let it dry, and then I'll do another application and another application. Like this blue painting started out as a green painting, and then it was a red painting, and then it ended up being a blue painting, and it must weigh 150 pounds. There's so many, and you can look up close and you can see the red and the green in there, but this was about 15 or 20 gallons of polymer. And so it kind of, they make their demands on you. Like it's kind of a feeling like, is it right or is it wrong? This one really had a lot to say in kind of what it wanted in a way. So, but yeah, I'm always constantly revising, and the color, I mean, one of the biggest parts of these paintings is the texture. Obviously is important, but the color is probably the most important point. And you really can't judge. I mean, on the computer, I draw them and I splice in the color, and I try to imagine what that would be like. But until you put, 70 inches of blue or whatever color it is down, you really can't know what it's going to be like. So constantly I'll make a move, and then I'll be like, oh, it needs to be a little desaturated, or it needs to be a little warmer or cooler or whatever. And all of that has to do with kind of taking a shot at it, see what happens, and then kind of adjusting to that, which is something the way I teach, where I'm like, you need to paint with your eyes open, like that the actual fact of the painting is the answer, and that you have an initial idea about it, but then you can kind of, while you're working, you look at it and you have to judge, like, okay, no, that's not good. I need to fix that. I need to change that. Or it works fine, And that give and take is what drives me to be an artist. Because it's never kind of something you get, and it's never resolved, and it always feels like you're just starting out again, in terms, because each experience is completely unique.
mentioned getting inspiration from seeing things out in the environment, but then you come back to your computer and you design before you get to work, and then you project and paint, or how do you get from, or can you walk me through that process?
Sure.
Computer design to canvas.
All right, so I render out in CAD programming the kind of structure itself, and then I print that out. And I have projected, like, actually all of these are projected except for the red one, which is the most recent one. And I hand drew that out with a large ruler and pencils and just looked at what I had and kind of worked it out. So projection was the way I usually worked, but I'm starting to think that drawing by hand, it helped, because when you project, there's some distortion that happens through the photographicness of it and the keystoning that occurs in the projection, and it's been sort of gnawing at me. So that red one I drew out by hand and found that really good, kind of as a way to. But I based it on looking at a computer printout of that. But what was interesting about drawing it out by hand was, even then, like I was just talking about with colors, once they get that big, they seem different. With that one, there's quite a bit of difference between that drawing and what the original computer printout was. So it's sort of like a steps into the whole thing, and I'll constantly adjust whatever the original impetus was for the piece. When I get to the final piece, it's usually different than what I started with.
And I do that some in video production. I'll have an idea, write up a script, go shoot it, come back to the edit bay doing, and it doesn't meet what I originally started with. How do you deal with that, or is it better in the end because you work through a whole process, or there's any that you look at and be like, this didn't work?
It's tough. I used to have this thing where the further I got away from the original idea, the worse it got, But now that I'm older, I guess, I sort of like the kind of going off road, like taking the farm road instead of going down the highway, and it's kind of more challenging. So now I don't fret if I'm not following what I initially thought, and I really think as the years go on that the source is not that important, and that actually the last thing you do, in paint, at least in painting. I don't know about video, like you're talking about video, making videos and things like that, but at least in painting, the being present and being in the actual moment is super important. So I put more importance on what's happening right then than what I thought I was going to do,
Can you tell me a little bit about, I guess you mentioned earlier, some coastal themes or ideas, but tell me a little bit about your choice of color and where the inspiration of that comes from.
Sure. So the color itself is a very complicated thing, and just like painting it, you never really figure it out. It always, as soon as you think you know it, it'll prove you wrong. Because color is relative to light, and when there's no light, there's no color. Depending on the light you're in, the light that's coming in, where things are seen or shown, they'll change the entire look of the work of art or the painting itself. So that's always interesting to kind of grapple with as an artist. But the way I think about color is sort of, it's like perceptual. I guess it comes out of like a Joseph Alber's ideas about interaction of color and how certain colors relative to other colors will affect the way we see those colors. I'm interested in how, I call it, this doesn't even make sense, but it's sort of like gestalt color, where like each one of these is a unique combination of colors, and they're all coming together at the same moment, and it generates a unique sort of set of characteristics. And I find that the way the paintings make you feel, or what they express to you psychologically through the color choices is important, but I don't really have control over that. I try to make decisions about what do I like, and sort of like what speaks to me in terms of like a combination of colors coming together to create a wholeness. All the works are about always go back to like, how do you make the piece whole? Like like that German word, the Gestalt or Gestalting, like the idea that, that there's not one thing more important than another. either it be the foreground or the background or the top corner or the middle of the painting, that it's all, there's a equivalence. And I try to do it with color too, where I hope that colors kind of play nice or play well together. Sometimes I like when they kind of clash, but I'm trying to kind of find a combination of things that seems right, if that makes sense. But my experience in grad school, my study in grad school, my research was based all in color. And I've studied Aristotle's ideas about color and Munsell's ideas, and I've gone through Goethe and Chauvel, all the different color theorists, and one thing that comes across from all of them is that color is relative. As Albert says, color is the most relative medium in art, and that's why it's so exciting. I think I like the way, I think that's why one of the main reasons I became a painter is the way color makes you feel. And using color, and I think paint is the greatest representation of color in the world, and making paintings with color like this, or just however you would do it, is such a luxury in a way, in terms of the way it provides joy. Like the color red, for example, using red is such a intense experience, and it's it's like one of my favorite things to do is to experience the color. And I don't know if that made sense, but
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we had to read a textbook in college that was all about color and video lighting. It was called "If It's Purple, Somebody's Going to Die." So in the 80s,
Yeah.
you watch a film, it was, think Africa,
Interesting.
colored a little bit purple. Something bad's probably
That's interesting. I haven't heard that. That's interesting. That's really interesting.
How important is it that these objects relate to individuals?
Oh, to like people?
Yeah.
I hope they relate in some way, but I don't really think about the viewer, if that makes sense. I do and I don't, but they're, I first make them for me. I don't know if this answers your question, but I first make them for me, and then hopefully someone else likes them, But in terms of if we're talking about, if I had to defend the relatability of them, they're similar to mandalas and the way the Tibetan mandala works, and kind of centering and concentric shapes. And I really, and I'm not spiritual, but I feel like these have a spiritual quality to them, and are about a plane of thought. But I hope the viewer gets something from them, but I don't make them thinking about an audience.
And so some of them we have a translucent window that we can see through. Is there a reason or what your process is going through? We can punch through and see some, and so
Right.
we don't.
So the whole setup is sort of like a play on, figure grounds. When you look at the paintings, there's the sky element, which is sort of like an open field, and then there's the ground element, which sort of pushes forward, and you got sort of push-pull ideas that come out in the paintings. And then the building itself usually offers this sort of really flat opacity that then leaves you kind of up on the surface. And then the window part is sort of where you get into the illusion of transparency. And that's sort of like a moment or an extra surprise, hopefully, that kind of leads you into the space through the building back to the horizon line that you can see on the sides. I'm kind of describing the painting itself, but it's sort of about transformation and materiality, and how there's, the solids in the world and the things that are air, and kind of and then also the way the horizon line meets you on the outside and then meets you on the inside, but in a different way, like a transference or a transformation's going on. And I've always been intrigued with that, even in my earlier work of skyscrapers, where you can look through the windows and you see the transparency in the windows, the like these squares. It's sort of like an abstract painting. Like the building is kind of like the thing that kind of draws you in. You're like, oh, well, that's a house. And then you get into the middle part and you're like, well, I don't know if that's a window or a door, but I'm going in there. And you go in there and then that becomes kind of like an abstract painting. So I'm trying to do kind of all these things all at once. And also not look like, or use a kind of a combination of conventions that doesn't look like a previous movement in art, if that makes sense.
It's about making the painting. That's beautiful.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
You teach. And so you've been a student, now you're a teacher.
Yeah.
You were always getting stuff from your teachers. Is there anything you get from your students?
Yes. Yeah, it's definitely a two-way street. And I get a lot of, well, like, for example, in the classroom, I'm sort of like I don't like to, I was never liked my teachers who were who used a lot of negative criticism. I never responded well to like, when a teacher felt like they were like coming after you in a way. And I've realized, at least in my own teaching, that I try to remain very positive towards the students. And I don't know if this is, but I try to, I find that if you just tell somebody, hey, good job, keep going, that does more than anything else you can do. Like, cause they'll figure it out themselves. Like, we're all artists. Like, I don't think like there's some sort of like special thing that one person has and another person doesn't. Like, I think it's a matter of just like dedication, time, and focus. And I think the things you're told and the things you tell yourself will determine if you can maintain a practice long enough to like figure out how to do something. So that is really refreshing to me because I see, and I only work with undergrads now, and I see within the 3 or 4 years I'm with them to go from sort of like not knowing what painting is to then having a body of work that then they're applying to grad school and getting in to schools for free. And that all has to just to do with their own awareness, like their own, building their own consciousness and becoming aware of what painting is, and then also like figuring out who they are, and then making a body of work that represents who they are personally. That's determined by them completely. Like, I don't do any kind of prompts in my teaching. The only prompt I have is you need to figure something out and stick with it for a while. And by doing so, you get better at something. So that's kind of the way I teach. And so I see this concept, I've seen this hundreds of times, and that gives me confidence in the idea of like my own studio practice. Now I'm in my 3rd decade. You know, what will it be in 3 more decades? You know, if I'm lucky enough to live another 30 years and I keep working, which I will if I'm still alive. But it's like that's what I learned from them, is that time is the artist's friend. Like, the more time you have to do something, the better.
Where have you found success in working in your environment? And then tell me about your new spot here and how it's been to move in, get it set up how you want to, and
Right.
work in this new location.
Well, I think I've always realized that, and it comes from that Joseph Campbell. He wrote The Power of Myth, but he talks about a sacred space. And that really resonated with me early on in my 20s. Like, you always have to have a place. And it could just be a table or a corner, or in my case, it was usually a garage, and just park the cars outside the garage. But of late, I've been lucky enough to afford to like create a standalone building. And have it next to the house. I like being kind of out in the yard as opposed to in another place, because I find a lot of time's wasted going, and a lot of energy's wasted going to and from. And I love just to roll out of the house in the morning, grab a cup of coffee, come in here and work. I found that the mornings are my best time. And when I'm getting ready for shows, I'll typically get up at 4 in the morning and work for 3 or 4 hours before anybody even wakes up. And that's kind of amazing for me. I find that's kind of my sweet spot. I like to work at night as well. I did that more as a younger artist, but the mornings are kind of are a great time to work. I talk to my students about this. I really think it's important to work every day. on some level that it's not something you do twice a week or every other day, but that you're constantly working. And I think it's better to work for a little bit every day than a couple of days. Because I think then you personally, when you go to sleep at night, you can allow the unconscious to kind of go over what happened. And then you wake up and then you've got other ideas about that and you can kind of move forward with the work. So discipline and rigor, that's where if I have the student, going back to students, who doesn't work hard, right? Or that's where I'm not interested. That's why, but like, as long as they're working hard and they're pushing themselves, that's the most important thing. And I think as an artist, it has to be serious in that way. So, and time, I keep all kinds of logs of time, and I'm always thinking about how can I get more time? How can I make this happen? So yeah, I'm constantly considering, I'm sort of obsessed with the studio. This is my favorite place to be.
You have a new assistant.
Yeah. Are you talking about Finn, my son? Yeah, that's been interesting.
How's life being an artist with having a youngster running around?
It's been a lot. Luckily, Lauren, my wife, is very good about giving me time and space to work, but I've had to be more efficient and figure out a way to get it done in 3 or 4 hours a day instead of 8 or 9, and kind of consolidate things down. And I mean, I can get a lot done in an hour because I realize how little time we have. And what's been weird about him being born is most people be like, no, if you have a kid, you're not going to have any time to work at all. But what's been interesting is ever since he was born, I've had more shows and more things happening than I've ever had in my whole life. And seemingly I've been able to get it done. So it just goes to show you that, like, in a way, at least for me, that the more I have going on, the more I get done. As opposed to this idea that I'm going to wait till I have once I retire, I'll have this big block of time to really do what I intended to do. But I don't believe in that at all. I think you got to get it done now, and he's helped me realize how important time is and the moment and just action, and just, I mean, I'm not saying don't think about it, but just sort of, he teaches me that, yeah, you just got to move. So, but I've definitely learned a lot from him, and having another child has been interesting in that, that you forget about what it's like to have, even though we have kids but you don't remember what it was like. And then you do it again, you're like, wow, well, this is really what it's like. So, and that's probably more than you want to hear about from the kids sector.
That's good. These are going to the show.
Yes.
Correct.
Correct.
All right. And so we explained a lot of the canvases. Explain the process real quick. You said these were 3D cut?
Yes.
And what's the concept here, and how is it to work in an actual 3D dimension?
Yeah, so in the past I had made some sculptures to then use as the maquettes for the paintings. These sculptures in particular happened after the painting, so it's sort of like reversed. So I made these paintings and then I made the sculptures, and it's been, the construction of the sculptures was achieved through the computer rendering. The CAD programs were used with a laser cutter, and then they cut all the planes, and then I assembled them together. I did it at the university where I teach at, with the help of some people there. And I put the planes together, and then I began to put paint onto them. The sculpture, in an unusual way, through doing the sculptures, it helped me think about the house form in a different way. And because they are three-dimensional, they're not an illusion of a house, they are actually a vessel, a container itself. It felt as if these needed to be more painterly. So it was almost like the sculptures are kind of like paintings, and then the paintings are kind of like sculptures, if that makes sense at all. And so where these are flat and kind of a compression and kind of speak about a kind of form and have a kind of structure to them, the sculptures are much more rigorous in terms of the way I'm applying the material and allowing it to really have its way. But when in the paintings, the material itself sort of carries the illusion of the house, and in the sculptures, it's more of like an idea about the paint kind of they almost kind of like mud or something, but to kind of like like making you think about the house form all of it's about making you think about that form differently. But it was definitely an interesting experience, sort of making these forms and thinking about the paintings, but in a sculptural form.